Hi everyone, sorry that we're a little bit late getting started on today's webinar, you know how Monday mornings go, but thank you very much for joining us. Speaking now is Nick Palmer, so I'm responsible for international business development at Group IB, and I'm actually here with Group IB's CTO and Head of Intelligence Division, Dmitry Volkov.
Hello everyone, nice to have you on our board. I'll be here just to support all questions about technical aspects of this Silence APT. So that's why feel free to ask questions in the question section, in chat, and probably you have some of our direct contacts also. Please feel free to mail me.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dmitry. And on today's webinar, it's mainly existing customers, but just for your privacy purposes, we did GoToWebinar instead of GoToMeeting, just so we could answer questions anonymously, etc. So because we were getting a lot of questions from existing customers about Silence Group, we decided to hold this webinar for our customers, you, of course, first and foremost, to go over the group in detail, cover some of the tools and techniques that they've used to attack financial institutions, and allow you guys to answer some questions to Dmitry, who his team had conducted the analysis. So let's jump into today's webinar. Sorry, I'm on a different machine today, so if you can't hear me or see something, maybe you could just poke me in the questions section, and we'll fix it for you. So I think since you're all customers, you know about Group IB, so we can skip this particular slide. And this next slide looks at the targeted attack landscape really from 2013 until present day. If we start on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see Anunak. So Anunak was really famous, operating until February of 2015. They focused on targeting many aspects of the bank. They targeted ARM CBR, which is the SWIFT analog system, payment gateways, card processing, and also doing ATM jackpotting. So they were really a visionary as far as targeted attack groups go, in terms of the different targets that they chose to attack within the bank. Next came Corco. Corco was really famous for targeting trading terminals. They targeted a trading terminal in Russia and managed to send more than 5 illicit payment transactions through this trading terminal and caused a fluctuation in the USD to ruble currency valuation of over 10%. So that was a relatively unique attack that we have not seen since, and they concluded their activities in September of 2015. Bootstrap and Lurk came after Corco and really operated until April of 2016. Both groups had arrests conducted against their organizations. Bootstrap's money laundering gang was arrested, and as they only targeted ARM CBR, the SWIFT analog system, they were really unable to conduct any further attacks without a trusted money laundering group. And some key members of the Lurk organization were arrested, and they ceased their activities in April of 2016 as well. So really now, if you look at the 3 different groups, Cobalt, Moneytaker, and Silence, they started their activities really all along the same time and continue up until present day, even with some major arrests of Cobalt criminal operators and malware writers. And really, we'll talk about Silence today. Silence as a targeted attack group we see as a young group. They're learning, and they really learn from past attacks that have been conducted by other organizations. So they're really a student of their craft and learn from other groups. And we'll cover them in much more detail today. So sorry, this foreign computer for me. There we go. So the criminal group is broken down into 2 main roles. We think it's a very small group, actually, with just 2 or potentially a few more individuals that control the operations and the development of different tools and tactics. The roles are developed. The roles are broken up into two different categories. The developer. This individual, the team believes, is a very highly skilled reverse engineer, but has less skills on the programming side, as we found logical errors in some of the code that was written. And he's obviously responsible to develop the tools for conducting the attacks, of which Silence developed a lot of custom tools for their particular attacks. Then they have the operator within the group. This operator is responsible to actually launch the theft within the bank and gain access to critical systems within the financial organization. So he has some pretty in-depth knowledge of penetration testing and some knowledge about the different processes within the financial institution itself. In terms of language, this is another Russian-speaking cybercriminal group, and we really have evidenced this from a number of different points. The choice of the infrastructure that they choose to use, they rent specifically from RU hosting providers that are friendly to Russian-speaking cybercriminals. The locations of their targets, mainly they were actually located in Russia, but they were also spotted targeting Central and Western Europe, Africa, and Asia as well. A lot of people actually, I think, misunderstand or have the wrong conception that Russian-speaking cybercriminals actually don't target Russia. A lot of the different targeted attack groups first test their tools and techniques in Russia, and then once they feel that they've reached a level of maturity necessary to attack foreign institutions, they shift those tools and techniques to target organizations in Europe or Africa or in the US itself. There was also some evidence towards them being Russian speakers in the commands and the code that they had. In the left-hand side, you can actually see some of the commands that we found in their main module, which don't make much sense in Latin letters, but if you switch the keyboard to Russian language keyboard, you can see it starts to make sense with reconnect, restart, and net zaдач, which means no tasks in Russian. So those were some of the elements that we identified as being a Russian-speaking group. So I'm just trying to get the GoToMeeting thing out of my way so I can see everything clearly. Beautiful. So this is really a timeline of Cylance operations, their attacks, but also tool development. So if we look on the left-hand side of the chart, you can see that they had their first attack against a financial institution in June of 2016. This attack was actually unsuccessful at targeting the SWIFT analog system against a bank in Russia. Actually, this attack comes about 6 months before Kikotat was discovered, and they actually used some patching capabilities to design it to launch a Cylance loader instead of the actual element that it was supposed to load in the end. Following their unsuccessful attacks against ARM CBR, they started to shift their focus onto ATMs and card processing, which was really common amongst groups like Cobalt and MoneyTaker at that time as well. So they took a hiatus or silence, if you will, and took some time to actually develop custom tools to attack organizations of their interest and areas of their interest. So they developed a Cylance proxy bot. This was basically a tool that they could use to communicate with isolated areas within the bank to proxy traffic from one infected host within the network that had internet connection to another one that didn't, and then receive commands back to their command and control server. They also developed Atmosphere, which was designed to attack ATMs. You can see that they developed Atmosphere in October 2017, and then they conducted their actually first attack against ATM systems in November of 2017. In February 2018, they conducted and were successful at targeting card processing systems, and then they shifted their focus back to targeting ATMs as well. And they actually continue their activity up until today, and we'll talk more about some of their recent attacks later on in today's webinar. In terms of geography, you can see the breakdown of the spear phishing emails that they sent. The majority of their targets were in .ru domain spaces, following by .com domain spaces. But as we mentioned before, they started to develop more comfort level, more maturity, and targeted Central and Western Europe, Africa, and a number of other countries that you see here on the bottom left-hand side. Why did Group IB take so much interest in this particular targeted attack group, other than the fact that they target banks and our customers are banks? If you look on the top right-hand corner, you'll see a phishing email that was sent actually to Group IB's CERT. So you can see that the receiver was response@cert-groupid.ru. And of course, once we received this phishing email with a malicious payload attached, our researchers were quite interested to get more involved into researching this particular group that affects both our customers and now, tries to target our organization itself. In terms of the tools that they developed some of their own programs. Cylance, as we mentioned, which was their main attack framework. Atmosphere, which was a set of programs that they customized to attack ATM systems. They also developed a custom program called Farce, which was the utility to grab passwords from infected computers. And to complicate the forensics investigation, they developed a program called Cleaner. They also used third-party tools. They used Smokebot in a few cases to conduct the first stage of the infection. They used Metapredator like a lot of other targeted attack groups as well. With exploits, there's nothing much interesting here. You can see all of the exploits that they used. Actually, for privilege escalation, they used some vulnerabilities that were from even 2008 and were successful at exploiting those in a number of different cases. They also used legitimate utilities as well. They used sdelete to wipe files, and interestingly, they used WinExe, which indicates to us that they were running Linux machines as well. So in terms of deeper into the tools, Cylance framework was broken up into really three main elements. You can see that it's broken up into Cylance Downloader, the main module. It also included Cylance ProxyBot, which I mentioned earlier was responsible for proxying traffic from hosts with internet access within the bank to those isolated networks in the bank without internet access. It also included Cylance Surveillance module. This module was only used once and basically was designed to create a number of screenshots so that they could kind of have a video of what was happening on the operator's computers. And this was used the one time, as I mentioned, for monitoring the workstations of the ARM CBR employee, the Swift analog system, so that they could understand how the payments were made, what happened, how did the payment documentations look, etc. And actually, this original framework was based on Kikothats, which was discovered by Symantec in 2015, and it actually inherits some of the commands from this particular Trojan as well. You can see WeGet and a number of others, which was included in the Cylance framework, as well as included in the Kikothats malware discovered by Symantec in 2015. In terms of the main module, you can see some of the commands that it has here on the left-hand side. I mentioned WeGet, which was included in Kikothats as well. It also had different commands for reconnection, for restarting, or no tasks. We'll actually show you how that looks later in today's presentation. But other than that, there was nothing really interesting in terms of the main module that they developed. ProxyBot, I've mentioned a few times, was designed to proxy traffic from a host within the network that had access to the internet to receive commands from the command and control server to proxy that traffic into an isolated network within the bank, for example, the ATM systems or card processing systems, for that answer to be sent back to the host which had access to the internet and return that result to the command and control server. Really similar to other tools like Cobalt Strike, etc. There are also three different versions of Silent ProxyBot. They had one written in Delphi. They later developed a version written in C# and had another version called proxybot.net as well. The surveillance module I've mentioned already, so we'll just cover this quickly. It was designed to collect screenshots of the infected host in order to learn what was going on. And those screenshots obviously created a little video where the Cylance group could learn what was going on. One other element of the Cylance surveillance module was some sandbox protection. So in the protection mechanism for this module, it had a time period that it would wait until it was launched in order to try and avoid sandbox detection. We've also seen that they were able to defeat some other sandbox solutions in recent attacks that they've conducted against very popular, well-known brands. We won't mention what they are. And we've been able to detect them with our TDS Polygon, which was quite interesting as well. Maybe Dimitri can talk more about that in the presentation. In terms of delivering phishing emails to their targets, originally they actually used mail.com and AT&T.net to target Russian financial institutions, which was kind of really abnormal. Usually they'd use mail.ru or some other Russian mail servers, not something from a foreign one. They also always created their own self-signed certificate and domains to bypass DKIM verifications. Here was some of the domains that they actually created to target different banks around the world, and it's quite interesting the way that they create their own SSL certificates as well. And it's one of the basically trails that we use to hunt them, and we'll talk about that later in today's presentation. They also used emails with real or consonant banking domains, but without SPF records to try to have better success in delivery of their phishing emails. So here you can see a couple of them, bankrab.ru, itbank.ru. They're not actually banks and have nothing to do with banks themselves, but they liked them because they didn't have SPF records and they thought that they'd have better success with those. One other interesting thing about the malicious files that Cylance sends is that they send CHM files, which is extremely rare and we don't see from other targeted attack groups. In terms of the exploits, something else that was very interesting during the campaigns from Cylance is that in August of 2017, the National Bank in the Ukraine warned both the public and private banks that there was going to be an impending attack from NotPetya. The reason that they thought this is that this phishing email that they were sending contained an exploit from APT28's repertoire, this CVE listed here. But actually what happened is they took this exploit from a report that ISET wrote in May of 2017, and they used byte patching process in order to modify it to launch actually Cylance backdoor instead of APT28. So that was really interesting to see both in the maturity of this particular cyber criminal group, to see how they're using security vendors' reports that have either been made public or semi-public, to acquire some of these tools to modify them in such a way that they can be used for their own malicious purposes. Also interesting is that in some of the EPS scripts that we found, they contained lyrics from popular songs like Slipknot, one of them from the song Snuff, which indicates a little bit more about their personality, perhaps their age range, and allowed us to learn more that the group is maturing as an organized cyber criminal group. In terms of malicious files, I already mentioned that they sometimes use CHM files. We've also seen them do that quite recently. So on October 13th was the first time that we saw them using CHM files to attack Russian financial institutions. And more recently, we saw them use that in campaigns within the last weeks, and we'll talk about that later on in today's presentation. In terms of lateral movement within the financial institution, they use Nmap in order to identify vulnerable hosts within the network. For privilege escalation, I mentioned that they use actually very old vulnerabilities, some from even 2008. And they had one custom tool that I mentioned earlier to extract passwords from memory called Farce. But actually, if you look at the logic of Farce listed on the left-hand side here, you can see that the logic is almost identical to Mimikatz. So they modified this tool. Perhaps it was just more comfortable for them to use Farce than Mimikatz, but in general, it functions as the same logic as Mimikatz. For remote control, we've mentioned they developed Proxybot to communicate with isolated hosts within the network. They had a Delphi version, a .NET version, and a C# version. For RDP access, they used standard MS RDP, WebRDP, and patched versions of term server.dll to allow parallel RDP sessions on different PCs. They also used RAdmin after the network was compromised, and used Cleaner to try and hide their traces within the bank and complicate the forensics investigations process. So now let's talk a little bit about some of the unsuccessful and successful attacks that they've had, and now some recent activity and investigations from Group IB into this particular group. Here you'll see a timeline of them attacking ARM-CBR, the SWIFT analog system. So their first access to one of the financial institutions and attempts on targeting ARM-CBR started in June of 2016. Probably 2 weeks later, a little bit more than 2 weeks later, after gaining initial access to the bank, they tried to launch a theft within that organization, but they actually made a mistake in some of the payment documentation on the 6th of July, and that led to the bank's organization conducting incident response. They believed that they actually had Cylance out of the network, but on the 19th of July, when the EXE was reinstalled, they then on the 30th, about 11 days later, got RAdmin on a server within the bank that had access to AWS CBR, the SWIFT analog system. On August the 1st, they had a modified version of KikoThats on the system that had access to AWS CBR, and then they launched their Cylance surveillance module to take screenshots of this particular host to try and understand how payment documentations can be done successfully, to try and avoid making mistakes. And actually on the 2nd of August, they made another mistake in one of the payment orders in the reconciliation files, which led to the internal security group noticing their presence again, and actually called Group IB to conduct the incident response, where we gained some more information about the group and cleaned the network for the bank. So that was interesting, and we haven't actually seen them target ARM-CBR again since these 2 failed attempts. And we'll talk about that actually more in the next slide here. When they shifted focus to targeting ATM systems around the same time as Cobalt, you remember all of the successful attacks by Cobalt Group, Cylance also tried to attack ATM systems, and actually were successful in 2017 and 2018 at withdrawing about $280,000 in 2 successful attacks against ATM systems. Not a super high return on investment for a targeted attack group, but nonetheless, they learned, they got better, and they still seem to be doing so. In terms of the ATM attack itself, in August of 2017, a phishing email was received by a bank in Russia. The message contained a subject line that said, "Message has been disinfected, double card debit." After the group got access on the next day to the bank's network, they scanned for infected hosts with Nmap. They detected a number of servers with a vulnerability to the CVE from 2008. They launched MetaPredator, uploaded Farce to collect passwords, and actually they managed to get access to a system that had AWS CBR on it, and they decided not to do actually anything. Instead, they launched WinEXE on a number of PCs that had access to ATM systems, and then conducted attacks using RAdmin on on the systems that had access to ATMs and Jackpot ATM systems. Interesting to see them shy away from actually targeting AWS CBR, even when they had access to it. Cylance also had successful attacks against card processing. In February of 2018, they conducted withdrawals that amounted to about $583,000 against a Russian financial institution, and obviously almost tripled their success rate at targeting different systems within the bank against card processing. Also interesting is that around this same time, groups like Cobalt and MoneyTaker were targeting attacks against card processing systems within banks as well. So this slide is probably one of Dimitri's favorites, and I know you guys are interested to research different elements of targeted attack groups and those that impact you. So this slide is kind of our mini guideline of the different tools and techniques that each cybercriminal group has and how they differ from one another. So if we look at Cobalt, MoneyTaker, and Cylance, and we start with initial infection, Cobalt really had massive phishing sendouts, and they didn't really send a lot of decoy documents. The messages were very lazy, poorly designed, had bad signatures within the emails. They also conducted supply chain attacks, which we haven't seen from MoneyTaker or Cylance Group. For MoneyTaker, they've been a really difficult group for us to track from the very beginning, and that was because we never found the initial infection vector during incident response. We later found out that they were exploiting vulnerabilities in certain types of routers. One example of this is targeting Cisco 800 series routers with certain vulnerabilities that didn't have additional support. We've never actually seen them send spear phishing emails. If you have a copy of one, we'd certainly like to have a look and investigate that for you. For Cylance, we talked about some of the phishing documentation. They have very well prepared email bodies. They use CHM files, which is unique to other targeted attack groups. And we also now know that they use Power MTA to send their phishing documentation. In terms of the tools that the groups use, Cobalt uses the same SSL certificates as in the past. They also use Alexis Mailer 2.0 to send their phishing documentation, and they have unique tools to target different areas within the bank. For MoneyTaker, they use well-prepared SSL certificates to hide traffic. They also have a unique ATM Trojan and a unique two-step verification Trojan as well. And they also have a unique tool to target the SWIFT analog system in Russia. One other unique point for MoneyTaker is that they use a very rare version of Ultra VNC. So it's a unique point for us in terms of attribution. For Cylance, they have Cylance Framework, which is unique, Atmosphere Pack to target ATMs, Farce, and the use of WinExe. These are some of the unique points that we use during attribution. Some other features for Cobalt, we noticed very often they create a local account, and it's always titled support for something, 452, 4482, these last two numbers always change. Some other features for MoneyTaker, they're very careful when they clean the traces, which makes them a difficult group to conduct IR on and learn about. For Cylance, they prefer to use the same hosting, and they have specific patterns within their SSL certificates that they generate. So how we track them and how you can track them if you're interested. The last point that I mentioned on the previous page is that they make specific errors or patterns within their SSL certificates that they create. So that's what we did is actually not we, but Dimitri and the tools that we've developed internally at Group IB. We scan all IPv4 pools every day to understand and collect new domains, passive DNS records, IPs from certificates, IPs from the domains from the certificates, and all of the information from them. And we've been doing this for the last 10 years. And this database helps us a lot to track different targeted attack groups where we might not have the samples for them. And that's actually what we did for Cylance. I mentioned at the very beginning of today's presentation that they always like to use the same patterns in the SSL certificates that they create. In the common field, they always put server.bank.ru. It's always this similar pattern with minor variations. In the organization column, they always say some organization. Locality, always some city, some state, some organizational unit. So you can start to see the patterns in the SSL certificates that they're creating, and by scanning all of these pools every day, we can start to then lessen the amount of certificates that we have to look at, and as a result start to track their infrastructure even without the samples. So that was quite unique for us. Then once we collect all this information, this is actually one of the internal tools that Group IB used during the investigation. We call it dark matter, which is an internal name for us. It's not external. So we used all of this information to track SSL fingerprints, the common fields, issuers, the SSH keys, IP addresses, domains, and that allowed us to identify all of these particular domains that they were using to send out phishing mail and bypass DKIM verifications. On the next page here, you can actually see some new SSL certificates that we identified. Actually, on October 16th, using this SSL pattern analysis, we identified new certificates that were going to be used for phishing purposes. You can see some of that information listed here. Then on the 16th, we identified a very strange phishing campaign. Actually, there was no malicious content in the emails that were sent out. However, many banks received this email on the left-hand side, and there was no malicious content, as we mentioned previously. However, if people clicked on this link, it would be if they clicked on unsubscribed here, they would actually be sent to the link, which didn't have any malicious content. What we kind of have as a working hypothesis is that they're testing the delivery rates and how successful they're being on the lists that they're using. And we were actually right in that assumption, because they launched on the same day a phishing campaign using CHM files sent to a number of Russian institutions. So it was interesting to see them do this reconnaissance during that phase of their attack operations. On October the 25th, after reconnaissance, they actually had another attack against UK institutions. They sent out phishing emails before, but with no malicious content, to test delivery rates. And after doing so, they actually sent a number of phishing documentation to organizations in the UK. Here you can actually see their Power MTA tool, the dates that they added these particular email addresses and sent out phishing emails to these organizations. Here you see the no malicious content and some of the items that were sent out to different organizations. There was actually a PNG file that was sent out, and if the email was read, they'd know if someone had launched that file and obviously read the email, and if it was delivered successful. So that was very interesting for us. Of course, by tracking their infrastructure, eventually we gained access to the back end of Cylance, and we've been monitoring their activity for some time now. Gaining access to their back end actually confirmed a lot of the elements that we knew about from the work that we did. All of the different commands in the Cylance back end were functional here on their actual back end. We wrote a simple script actually to test if it worked. The team thought we should say run Forest run, but that idea was quickly revoked by Dimitri, that was a bad idea. So that's actually what their back end looks like, and a lot less graphically pleasing than other targeted attack groups that we've researched in the past. Here was actually the back end to Proxybot, and you can see here some of their IP addresses. They had written an automated script to check their servers every 2 minutes. They used Tor to hide their IP, and of course, this Tor usage was disrupted, and we were able to identify actually the real IPs of this group. So we're currently investigating a lot of their activities, and we hope that this was a useful presentation into the Cylance group. And Dimitri and I would certainly be happy to answer any questions from you today. Sorry about that. I'll go back.
More questions?
You are unmuted. Wonderful. Well, thank you all very much for joining today's webinar. Of course, if you have questions and you don't want to ask them amongst other Group IB Intelligence customers, you can reach me on email and I'll put you in touch with Dimitri and his team. Thank you all very much for taking the time, and we look forward to meeting you guys in person at upcoming conferences.